Welcome to Introduction to Literature. This is one of our first readings. I'm going to ask you to download this from the resources, course reading. And basically this is a preview or an overview of one of the texts. It serves as the basis for the grounds of interpretation for all of our texts this semester. Now, this does not come from out of the blue. When you were in high school, you probably did a number of what we call close readings. It comes indeed from the school called the New Criticism, and that school was founded by John Crow Ransom, and along with a number of other critics, I.A. Richards, T.S. Eliot, William Emsert, and etc. Now, the text that you're looking at is a modern-day application. Now, Ian Johnston is a professor, I believe in Canada, and his text that was available online was On Scholarship and Literary Interpretation. And there are a couple of main points. I chose this reading because it specifically covers those points most relevant to our interpretive guidelines. For instance, when we talk about a text, we start by looking at the text itself. Literary interpretation, then, is a form of argument. You find a meaning and you find evidence for it. And obviously that interpretation and that argument follows the basic rules of reason. Now, here is probably something you already knew. Works do not have a single interpretation. In fact, there are as many possibilities as there are readers. However, all suggestions, even though they're valid to begin with, have to be put to a test of questions. So even though everyone may have a different interpretation, everyone must have reasons and evidence for them. For instance, these interpretations follow an argument based on rules of logic. Occam's razor is the famous statement or principle that the simpler explanation is the better, and if you can account for most of the work, it's better than accounting for just some of it. Now, specifically, the New Criticism is a school of criticism that developed in the late 30s to the early or late 60s, but it's still influential today. Especially its techniques for analyzing the formal properties of literature. Now, every school of criticism and every interpretive grid, in some ways, reacts to a previous interpretive grid. And one of these was the biographical criticism that flourished in the beginning of the 20th century, and that understood art primarily as a reflection of the author's life. There was an emphasis to move away from that particular viewpoint. Now, we still use biographical criticism, and it is still valid to a certain extent. It is, I think, unreasonable to think that a text does not in some way relate to the author's life. However, to make it the sole purpose was not effective and also not of interest to this party who developed the New Criticism. Another interesting factor in the development of New Criticism and what we do today in literature is the competition for dollars and students in the early part of the 20th century. Basically, the sciences were seen as the most important form of discipline, the most important branch of knowledge. So there was a move to make criticism more objective and more scientific. Plus, new forms of mass literature, especially film and pulp fiction, and an increasingly consumer society where literature was something to be consumed, swallowed, and then thrown away, plus the increasingly visible role of all of these things in everyone's life, argued for your need to look at literature as something a little bit more refined, a little bit more worthy of in-depth study. Plus, there was increased enrollment from students who previously couldn't afford college. It no longer became the practice of the elite. Partially as a result of the GI Bill, a number of young men were able to go to college, but then again, they were afforded a liberal arts education at the same time being given that impetus to, somehow justify what they were doing in terms of their career. So therefore, literature developed as a discipline, and it looked for a school of criticism that would make interpretation more, objective, more scientific. But in some ways, it's not as simple as black and white. There still are a number of ambiguities in any interpretive result. And here's just a timeline of the American criticism, a basic idea of our history. And you can see that the origins were in the 20s and 30s. And then the practical dominance, that means used in the classroom, circulated via many articles when professors get their PhDs. They spend their lives producing articles and criticism. And a number of them were based on this close reading. Even today, even with other schools of interpretation, that close reading is still a basic tool. Key assumptions of the new criticism involved the idea that the work is independent of an author's desire or intent. The intentional fallacy was the belief that a reader's response is neither equivalent to nor relevant to the interpretation of a poem's meaning, which means that it's a fallacy to think that the only thing about the work is whether or not the author meant it to say that. Also, on the other hand, the affective fallacy argued that basically the poem's interpretation was independent of how the reader felt about it. The bottom line was drawn from the famous Romantic poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who said that the chief feature of a poem, which we can substitute for any work of literature, is its organic unity, that all parts are interrelated. Art has parts, and therefore we can analyze it. Now, there was also an evaluative criteria, and that auxiliary is superior poetry achieves oneness through paradox, irony, and ambiguity. Now, these terms I think that you have heard before, and you probably have a rough understanding of paradox, something unexpected, something conflicting. Irony, also unexpected, the opposite of what one would expect in any outcome, for instance, defines situational irony. And ambiguity, when there's a gap in the text and one or another interpretation is possible. Now, the objective correlative is something that T.S. Eliot came up with. And basically, it was once again in the mode of making interpretation more scientific. So any text relies on a set of objects, for instance, sound features, alliteration, plot, character, setting, symbols, and all of these things work together to evoke an emotional response. And basically, that the key to good art was that the text brought forth this. It showed it. It demonstrated. It evoked it, rather than it just actually said, now, this really cloudy day should make you feel sad. Now, Clenneth Brooks was one of the new critics, and his book, The Well-Wrought Urn, was incredibly influential in promoting the idea that the meaning of a poem is complex and cannot be paraphrased without distortion. So one of our strategies this semester will be to paraphrase a poem, but we know that a paraphrase of a poem is, in some ways, not the poem itself. It's just simply a study aid. So bottom line, as I go onto the next text, is it's all about the text, just the text. So we need to look at the formal properties of a work first. Now, there are some fancy words here like autotelic artifact. But basically it means it's all there. It's complete in itself. It's written for its own sake. And it's not dependent on the author. And honestly, it's not dependent on the reader. Again, this is an extreme theoretical point of view. In practice, I think we're going to find there are different ways to look at it. For instance, think of a vase that's set inconspicuously against the white wall of a museum, with all of our attention going towards the formal properties of the vase itself, without context, and you have a perfect metaphor for the new critical milieu. Here's a picture. The work. It asks us to focus on itself. And just to help you remember, Godzilla versus Mothra. Your thesis relies too heavily on assumptions of the real intent. Arr. So, in short, Just the text, ma'am, just the text. This criticism used a number of methods. The interpretive model begins with a close examination of the poem's words, and then it moves to fancy things like allusions. What references to other works of literature? Maybe there's a pattern in phrases. In Walt Whitman, he begins a whole section, or in fact an entire poem, Song of Myself, by listing. And so each line of poetry begins with the roar of the pavement, the scream of the eagles, the lilting of the harmonious lyre. That sort of listing is a pattern of phrases. Figures of speech, metaphor, simile, that sort of thing. We all know about symbols. They stand for more than what they appear to be. Tone, setting, and character. All of these things we will cover in the course. Bottom line, the main method of the new criticism is called explication du texte. Pardon my French accent. And it is called simply, in English, a close reading. As you know, a number of different terms came up when we were defining the new criticism. One of them was irony. Everybody knows irony. In fact, they called the postmodern age and the post-postmodern age the age of irony. So, what is irony? Well, in verbal terms, it's a figure of speech in which words express a meaning that opposes its original or usual intent. Seemingly, a paradox is a self-contradictory statement such as always darkest before the dawn, or we have to lose ourselves to gain our freedom, and thus ultimately ourselves. Irony, I'm sure you can all think of a great example of irony. For instance, like rain on the wedding day. Remember Alanis Morissette's song? I know that's dating me, but it's a very good example. Ambiguity is simply conflicts or tensions in multiple possible meanings. So, for instance, was Matilda responsible for her own destiny, or was she the victim of fate? Did she acquit herself well, or was it all a wash because she started off with the wrong motive? The end of the story is very telling in that sense. The end of the story shows her getting upset with Madame Forestier for starting the whole big mess and blaming her ultimately. In other terms, I'm sure as we saw in class, there were more than one possible readings, and there were also moments in the text where it could have gone either way. Bottom line, irony, which is of course the main point of this slide, is that the poet's tool to recognize the incongruities and is essential for the production of paradox and ambiguity. So irony is sort of like the essential element of paradox and ambiguity. It's all about self-contradiction. It's all about apparent conflicts. To expect the unexpected is a conflict. So bottom line, when you're reading this semester, whether it be in class, in your room, out on the lawn, while you're waiting in line at the supermarket, on your phone, you want to read actively. So, what happens in the text? You got to understand that first. Who did what? Who is who? Note first impressions of the characters. Yes, the is important. Setting, point of view, possible repeated elements. Is there always a reference to a certain phrase or an object? Now, it's always important to ask questions. For instance, here's one of the most dominant questions in The Necklace. Is Matilda supposed to be like many other Parisians of the time? Or is she supposed to represent a typical woman? For instance, are we supposed to read this as a flaw in gender or a flaw in human nature? And that, my friends, is the end of this first presentation. We'll see you in class.